So if you just joined us, you're watching EWTN's live coverage of World Youth Day 2023. That live shot you're seeing now of the ITA Airways plane is after landing, touching down from Rome with the Holy Father on board. Matthew, the last time Pope Francis stood on Portuguese soil, that was 2017?
Yes, it was. For the centenary of the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima. So an important moment in the history of the apparitions, and the message this time is going to be somewhat similar, where he reflected on the Blessed Mother and the importance of following her as a perfect disciple.
And Matthew, you have covered so many papal trips and papal visits to countries all over the world.
Yeah.
What can we expect? What is the rhythm and routine when the Holy Father lands? What are we going to see happen today?
Well, there are two aspects to every papal trip. There is the diplomatic side. So we're going to see today especially his meeting with the president and then also the prime minister. And then he's going to have a meeting, an encounter with the representatives of civil society, those who are in authority, but also the culture and the arts, because the message that he brings is for everyone in Portugal. And then he will be shifting into sort of World Youth Day mode, where he's going to have those encounters with young people. He's going to Fatima. He'll have the beautiful Stations of the Cross, and then the intensity increases, as they always do with World Youth Days, and really a lot of papal trips. We'll have the vigil, where young people, by the hundreds of thousands, will be camped out here overnight. And then we'll have the final closing Mass, where he will then send them out.
People are always fascinated. They ask me all the time, how does the Pope travel? Does he have his own plane? Is it like Air Force One? But it's normally ITA Airways, which is the national carrier of Italy.
It used to be Alitalia.
It used to be Alitalia, and then they changed
Right.
it recently. Or it would be the host airline of a country, isn't that right? That would.
Typically, I think it was Alitalia, and then now ITA, since there were a lot of changes to Alitalia.
It's another story.
Another story indeed.
But it's wonderful when we see the shots here coming from the helicopter, and we see the flags proudly blowing outside of the window, the papal flag there.
That's right.
Of the Holy See, and then the Portuguese flag as well.
John Paul II always had a routine when he could. When he would come down the stairs, he would kiss the ground of the country he was visiting. As he grew more infirm, and we all watched him getting older, they made it easier for him, so actually they would bring him a little bit of the soil of the country, and he would kiss that when
Really?
he landed. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Pope
a very
Francis-
famous clip when he came to Ireland in '76, I think it was, that when he kissed the ground.
Exactly.
Young people of Ireland, I love you as well, he said on that trip, which is kind of in the psyche, the mind of Irish people still to this day.
Yeah, and that great phrase of his, "Be not afraid," which is a message that he carried everywhere. And I think that's a phrase, too, that we need to have for young people. Be not afraid. You were talking earlier about the stresses and really the fear that a lot of young people have. Do I live my faith publicly? Well, John Paul's message was, yes, don't be afraid about that.
Well, as Matthew said, that in a few moments, when the Holy Father disembarks from the plane, he will be meeting the President and Prime Minister of Portugal, and then he will also be meeting one of the main organisers, who is Carlos Moedas. He is the Mayor of Lisbon. Now, a few months ago, we travelled here to Lisbon for EWTN News, and we talked to him about many of the logistical challenges, the costs associated with World Youth Day. It's 150 million euros approximately to host an event like this. Some of it is provided by the church, the rest of it provided by the Portuguese state. But yesterday, I had an opportunity to catch up with the mayor to find out how everything has been going so far and get his general instant reaction. Here he is. Mr. Mayor, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Welcome back.
It's good to be
Welcome
back. When we last met, we were anticipating this. We were worried about accommodation. People were complaining about the cost. Some people were looking forward to it. Now the moment has arrived. How is everything going?
It's very well. I think that we are giving an example also to the world that a city like Lisbon is prepared, that we were able to do our job. You know, like just in accommodation for young people, we have 43,000 people that we are really putting in schools. They sleeping there, they're happy. So we found ways, as I told you, to get everyone, not just in Lisbon, but also in municipalities around. And so everybody has to stay. And if not, the Lisbon people, they are open arms to get them and to help everyone.
What has been the most difficult part of arranging something on the scale of this?
You know, it's like we have never done something of this size and scale before. So at the beginning, we didn't really know how to prepare for such a big thing. And my way was like to divide the problem in slices and then start working in every project with a project manager and a coordinator. And we did it. I mean, I think that it was all about preparation, about preparing the procedures, about really getting all these public procurement contracts. And we were able to do it just so much ahead of others, because normally these things, you do it until the last day, and we were able to do it like 1 month before. The new green park that we'll have down to the river will be for the city. It's in a beautiful place that now has this altar with the stage, and it will be green. So it's a new piece of the city that will stay after the Pope leaves. And here in the center, in the downtown of Lisbon, where you will have these images of this amazing, beautiful town.
It's been quite extraordinary for the Catholic Church in Portugal this year. On one hand, that report that was released about the sexual abuse and the terrible crimes of the Church. And on the other hand, you have this incredible event with the youth, the hope for the future. How are those two balancing out in the minds of Portuguese Catholics?
Look, of course, I mean, everything related to any crime, and specific those kind of crimes, are horrible. And I think that it's up to the Church, and the Church is dealing with that, and there was openness and transparency about what happened, and that's what is important. But now I think the important thing is not about that. Of course, that is very important, and it was dealt by the Church. Now it's about the union of everybody around the world, here in Lisbon, getting together and thinking about the future. But of course, all the crimes are horrendous, and those types of crimes are horrendous, and the Church is dealing with it all over. I think it's transparent, and I think that it's very good that the Church is so transparent about everything that happened, and I think that's a good step to the future. But now I think that in a moment like this, I really want to focus on all these young people together, thinking about climate change, artificial intelligence, what they do want for the future of the world, and not only Catholic, but also everyone, those that don't believe, those that have different religions, thinking about the future of humanity.
And finally, Mayor, you personally, what are you looking forward to most about World Youth Day?
I think I'm looking forward really being with people from all over the world. I've been walking on the streets, I've been out walking and talking to people, and just to feel that they love my city. And I think that nobody after these will be the same. Like this point in time in Lisbon will be a crucial point in time for the city and for the people. As I met Pope Francis, he told me that after this kind of days, people are not the same.
Wow.
And I think that it will be transformed not just by the spiritual part, but also by this city. And I'm so happy that every foreigner I meet, they say, look, this city is not just beautiful, but the people are beautiful. People really welcome you, and you feel that you belong already to the city. And that's very fulfilling. I want the image of Lisbon to be great, and it's a great city, so we deserve that. We deserve to be, at some point, you know, there will be 500 million households that will see this image of this amazing city, and I'm super proud of that.
That was our discussion with Carlos Moedas, the Mayor of Lisbon, who has been overseeing much of the organising of World Youth Day from the Portuguese government's point of view, overseeing the spending, the organising and so on. If you just joined us, you are watching live pictures there on your screen of this is Lisbon's International Airport. Pope Francis has just touched down in the past 10 minutes or so. He was escorted in by Portuguese fighter jets as his ITA Airways plane flew in around a 2-hour journey from Rome. Now, Matthew, we just spoke that he will, of course, be greeted by authorities from the Portuguese government.
Yep.
He'll meet the Prime Minister and the President. In these meetings with Pope Francis on the first day of a papal trip, what happens in these meetings? Are they substantive meetings, or is it simply protocol?
It can be a little bit of both, actually. So he'll be greeted, and then we'll spend a little bit of time with President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa. In this system of government here, you have a president who's more of an honorary figure. He does have some constitutional powers. And then he will later have a probably more substantive meeting with the Prime Minister, Antonio Costa. The two are very different. One is one of the former heads of the Social Democrats here in Portugal, conservative Catholic. The Prime Minister, Antonio Costa, is an ardent socialist. So very, very different policies from certainly many of the positions of the Catholic Church. So that's likely to be one topic. Now, always with these, you have areas of common ground where you can find that discussion point. There are, of course, disagreements in areas of LGBTQ, on abortion, contraception, and other things. But I think the two of them will have great common ground and a great concern of Pope Francis, and that is Laudato Si, care for the environment. So that there will be those conversations that will happen. Look for Pope Francis's speech today to the authorities of Portugal, the civil authorities and those in culture. In the past, popes have used those for pretty important messages. I think of Pope Benedict XVI when he came here, I think in 2010, and used that as an occasion to give, not an admonition, but a warning of concern for Portugal, that it was moving towards secularism and relativism, one of the great themes of his pontificate. And we have certainly seen that in this decade since. There has been a real onset of relativism and secularism in Portuguese culture and politics.
So when a pope touches down in a country and they have the ear of the president, the prime minister, and then by virtue of the entire country watching live on television, it's a chance for them to be direct in some of their messages, or sometimes to be more subtle?
More subtle, I think. There's a lot of diplomatic protocols that have to be followed. The conversations will likely, again, touch on areas of common ground. That's standard. Every pontificate is going to have some disagreements with almost every government around the world. That's certainly the case with the United States, whether it's President Trump or President Biden. So we'll see that today. I doubt that we will have a lot of details about his meeting with Prime Minister Costa. There will likely be a telegram that will follow, and I promise the word serene or cordial will be used.
It was interesting when I interviewed the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, Joseph Donnelly from Indiana, and I asked him that. Is it difficult in your position to be an ambassador representing the United States at a time when many of the policies of the U.S. government are in direct opposition to the teachings of the Catholic Church? And he said, of course, well, look, we focus on the things we have in common and not the things we don't have in common. But Father Mark, we have to remind people, of course, that the Catholic Church is the Catholic Church, but it also is an independent nation, the Holy See, an independent state. So he's coming as a head of state as well, with a diplomatic sway and power as well. So these are very important on many different levels.
Right. And just the spiritual side of it, I think it's so important. I mean, it's a real meeting, right? They can talk about real issues, and also just symbolic of the role of the gospel, that we have something to say to all levels of society, that the role of the laity is to engage in temporal affairs. You know, Catholics should be in politics. We have a duty to work towards the common good, to transform this world. How do you do that? With gospel values, with the spirit of the Beatitudes. So the Church speaks about morality and requirements of protecting the dignity of the human person to make this place a civilization of love, to try to make it more of a place of heaven than hell. And it's a vital role. I mean, it keeps us from tearing each other apart, right?
Yeah, and one of the messages that we certainly saw this under Pope John Paul II, the ongoing development, and we've seen this with Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, of Catholic social teaching and how it's applied in culture, in the political realm. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, it means that as you're formulating policies, what are the impact of these policies going to be on the dignity of the human person, on the most vulnerable? You know, Pope Francis talks about going to the peripheries. That's one of the keys for him, the forgotten, the vulnerable. And I think that's something that he's always raising. And in a throwaway culture, he talks about a throwaway culture and the various ideologies that are taking place. So I think that's something, too, that he's likely to touch on.
And talk about going to the peripheries. In just a few months, Pope Francis will be making a much longer journey to Mongolia. And at 86 years of age now, when you think 4 years off his 90th birthday, these are very tiring and difficult journeys for the Holy Father to make.
They are. And this is, any journey now for him is one that's going to be tiring. That's why you can see it in the schedule.
It's been pared back a lot, hasn't it, in
Yes,
comparison to other papal visits?
That's right.
And just even thinking now, just reminded of the war in the Ukraine, the Pope has been a strong voice for peace. I mean, it becomes politicized in our country, you know, the political divides step in and stuff, and he can be there independent of that to say, let's say if we can send some ambassadors to work, just kind of foster a peaceful situation.
I think Father raises a very important point about the fact that here is arriving a head of state. The Holy See has diplomatic relations with about 183 countries around the world. I think there are only 13 states or so that it doesn't have any sort of diplomatic relations with.
Many countries say that their embassy to the Holy See is one of their most important diplomatic missions.
Well, that's right. Historically and today, the Holy See, as we're seeing, for example, with Pope Francis's involvement in Ukraine, sending Cardinal Matteo Zuppi as his personal representative to try to bring peace to an area. He's considered an honest broker. We saw the same thing with Pope Francis about a decade ago in Syria with its civil war. So there are very important roles that the popes can play in the world of politics, in the reality of the sort of the global crises that we have today.
And various nations know that all too well. Switzerland recently, in the last number of years, opened up a new embassy to the Holy See. And you've seen that too, Father Mark, haven't you? The power that the Catholic Church has to influence politics all over the world, to be that voice, maybe when it's not in certain countries that strong.
Right.
The Vatican can come in, the Holy See, and be that voice.
Right. I think we're making a distinction like between the hierarchy of the church and the laity. I mean, the laity has a secular character. They are to be in the world. They are the front lines. They are to bring, gospel values into forming policy. What kind of economy you're going to have? What kind of how you're going to have fairness for all to serve the dignity of life. So the church hierarchy, though, is proclaiming those values. They're not making policy, so to speak. And that's an important distinction, because I think the secular world gets afraid of that. Say, we don't want the church. And I remember Pope Benedict saying, when the church has a lot of temporal power, things usually don't go well.
Yes.
Right? That's the role of the laity.
And that was another thing that came up when we were producing that report about the Catholic Church in Ireland and why it declined so much. And they were saying, well, maybe perhaps it had too much power in the state. I mean, everything had a religious element to it, or the Catholic Church was involved in.
And I think what happens, it gets intertwined.
Yes.
So when people want a new government, they throw out the church with
Yes,
it, right?
yeah.
If we're too involved, too much in bed with each other.
But the church, of course, so important, it still has influence, and again can still be promoting life at every turn.
And it's, like you mentioned, it's to be, like you said, the countries value the diplomatic presence, because as the world gets crazier and the values are just turned upside down and things are more chaotic, even after the French Revolution, after Napoleon, they were looking for the church to come back in with some strength, I think we're in that situation again,
Yeah, go ahead.
I remember speaking to the British ambassador to the Holy See, Christopher Trott, and he said to me an interesting point when I asked him, why do countries still have ambassadors to the Holy See? He said, world leaders can speak to people's minds, but spiritual leaders, like, for example, Pope Francis, can speak to people's hearts in a way that politicians cannot. And that is why it's so important to have that connection and relationship.
Well, there's a famous quote, I think, from Joseph Stalin asking, how many legions, how many divisions does the Pope have? Yeah. He doesn't need them.
Now, we are watching this live picture along with you at home of Pope Francis's touchdown. He has been on the ground now for the past 10 or 15 minutes or so here in Portugal, and we are awaiting the Holy Father to step down from the plane at any moment now. Who is the first person normally that he meets, Matthew?
Typically, it would be, in this case, I believe one of the heads of state, so that would be President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, and a delegation that would be greeting him there in an official capacity. Again, we talk about the fact that there's a key diplomatic aspect to any papal trip to a country. Now, what's interesting is that in 1967, when Pope St. Paul VI came here, he kept his trip very short because at the time there was something of an authoritarian government here, and he didn't want his visit to be used. We'll see the popes willing to go almost anywhere. Pope Francis, Pope John Paul II especially, willing to take those risks of going around the world and to be encountering what would be very problematic governments. In this case, we have the greeting here at the airport by somebody who's a Catholic, the President de Sousa. But that's a point that I think is worth making, that to carry your Catholicism into the political realm really matters. It's important to do, as Father was saying.
I always love this beautiful moment. I remember covering the Pope's historic trip to Iraq and seeing the young people coming up with the flowers. This was always such a beautiful, sweet moment that we're seeing here after he meets the President or Prime Minister. The young Portuguese children will present him with flowers in the papal colours. Beautiful guard of honour there as well. And if you're just joining us, this is EWTN. You're watching our live coverage of World Youth Day, which kicked off yesterday officially. Some people say, Father Mark, that it doesn't really kick off until the Pope touches down. So we could be watching the second launch of World Youth Day now. Must be such a beautiful moment. Think of those children, and I'm sure they're as nervous as anything, standing there about to greet the Pope. But what a wonderful moment for them.
And they're old enough, I think, that they will remember this forever,
Forever,
the rest
for the
of
rest
their
of
lives.
their lives.
As Pope Francis, you don't have a chance to meet the Pope very often,
Yes.
for the average person, especially young people. So this is a very special moment in their lives, but I think it's also a great moment for Portugal.
It's interesting that Pope Francis is using the stairs today. We've seen in previous trips, I think perhaps in Canada as well last year, where they had to use the elevator for the wheelchair. So I've just been told actually by our producer Greg that we may actually see him using the elevator. We'll have to wait and see. At the moment it seems that they will be using the stairs, but I'm sure just inside at the moment everything is final preparations being put in place and a lot of things to do before the Pope steps down.
Well, with the Pope Francis's decline in overall health, he's 86, as we've noted. He spent some time in the hospital this year. He had pretty significant surgery not that long ago. So with any decline, we saw this also with Pope St. John Paul II, where you make accommodations, but you keep going. And Francis, I think, is very determined to keep going in these global trips.
Because we remember last year he had a scheduled trip to the Democratic Republic of Congo and then to neighboring countries, South Sudan. That was postponed. Some people thought, well, perhaps maybe because the trip is so far and taxing that it might not happen.
Right.
It did happen, and the Holy Father went.
Well, that's right. And one of the reasons it happened is, as he himself joked, that he had a bad knee. And he was having some problems with his joints. And he's very famously had sciatica for many years. That has gotten worse. But the knee itself gave him severe mobility issues. And what did he do? He improvised. He kept going. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen become one of those hallmarks of Pope Francis over these last years as he's dealt with these health issues.
In Canada as well, flying across the huge landmass that is Canada, from Toronto to Edmonton, up to the very, very top of Canada. That's scheduled too. I think it was one main event a day they scheduled for the Pope, right, and then smaller events. Whereas I remember in Iraq, the schedule was full from morning until night. So just a very grueling schedule. But here we see now, this is Vatican dignitaries and various personnel and officials with the Holy Father coming off. The journalists have already disembarked from the stairwell at the rear of the plane. So it may be indeed that we're waiting for the Pope to come down the stairs, or he could be using the lift on the other side of the plane.
So popes, again, because of the diplomatic nature of this, are typically accompanied by members of the Secretariat of State. Most often, the Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, and various other officials, including Archbishop Gallagher, who is the equivalent of a Vatican Foreign Secretary. And then you have other members of what's called the Apostolic Camera, or the Papal Household, all of them who travel with the Holy Father. And then, of course, you'd have also his own security,
the Swiss Guard,
elements of the Swiss Guard, and others. So any papal trip, we were talking earlier about the logistics of organizing a World Youth Day. Well, any papal trip is very similar along those lines, where you have to have those logistics in place, again, because he's a head of state, but also because he's a Holy Father.
And important to note as well that flying on the plane as well are many journalists. Sometimes it can be up to 50, 60 journalists from networks all over the world. And now, as we see here on the screen, there is Pope Francis, who did come down from the other side of the aircraft in his wheelchair. And a nice warm greeting. Looking very happy to be here in Portugal.
Not to mention a very enthusiastic welcome from President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa.
And here we have the beautiful moment with the young people now in the presentation of the flowers to welcome Pope Francis on his trip here to Lisbon for World Youth Day 2023. What has he handed the children there, Matthew?
Typically it would be papal medals or also rosaries. And he very prudently has removed his zucchettas, since as anyone who's spent much time in Lisbon over the last few days can know that the winds here right off the Tagus River can be very strong.
We've had that problem here in the studio with our sheets flying left, right, and center.
I was struck by what the mayor said about having pride in their country. I thought that's such a beautiful thing. We should take a healthy pride in our culture, our country, what gifts they have to offer. So to see all the
And
stuff.
just as you
pulled out.
speak, Father, there is the mayor shaking his hand at this very moment. So sorry, Father, I cut across you there.
No, yeah, patriotism is a beautiful thing. You know, it's a virtue, and I love it to see people be proud of their culture, their identity, where they're from.
There is a healthy way to be patriotic and be proud of your culture, proud of your history, proud of your land, proud of your people.
Right.
You know?
Yes, no country is perfect, but there's always great moments, you know, and great virtues that can be exemplified by every country.
And as you said, point me to a country in the world that doesn't have its problems or its flaws. You know, we'd be here for a long time trying to find one.
Well, we've been having a recurring theme in this conversation about the fact that there are two elements. There's the diplomatic and then there's the ecclesiastical. Well, this is a perfect little demonstration of how both are at play here at this airport with the arrival of Pope Francis in Lisbon. We had the greeting by the civil authorities, but then there were also the leaders of the Catholic Church in Portugal. So I believe we saw the Patriarch of Lisbon, Cardinal Clemente. But then we also had representatives of the Vatican diplomatic corps that are here in Lisbon. Typically, you'll have the nuncio, for example, which is the Vatican ambassador. I believe it's Archbishop Scapolo, who's based here. So each of those is in perfect balance in a way. You can see this in the image, and this is what's going to be playing out now. Today, in particular, I think is of interest in that regard because we have this meeting, but then Pope Francis will be going to the presidential palace of Belém, where he will have a slightly more formal encounter, brief as it is, with the President, Rebelo de Sousa. Then he will have the meeting with the civil authorities, again, at the cultural center of Belém. These are important architectural and cultural icons for Portugal and places where important things happen. And then later today, he will be having Vespers, and we'll be covering that, with the leaders of the church here. So that's the cardinals, bishops, seminarians, priests, and men and women religious. And I look forward to his comments to them here arriving for World Youth Day, but this is an opportunity for Pope Francis to have that encounter with the leaders, the Catholic leaders in Portugal, and I think his message to them in the face of things like secularism, but especially the report on sexual abuse. So these are things that are milestones to note over the next few days.
I think with all the popes I've done, maybe it is because I'm a priest and religious, but I always find those are very spiritual talks when he talks to the religious, and he's got, you know, they have some real meat to it and insight. Those are always great addresses.
Yeah. And I go back, too, to Pope Benedict's comments here to the civil authorities back in 2010, but also I think that same year when he traveled to England and spoke, I think it was in Westminster Hall, the very place where Thomas More was sentenced to death, and had very important things to say about the contributions of faith to culture and the role that faith has to play in culture, to your point, Father, from earlier.
Right. It's almost like the church is like the last house on the block for sanity today. I don't put it too strongly, but I just heard like one of the messages from Fatima. Our Lady told Jacinta that, you know, war is a consequence of sin. You know, we hear a lot about chastisements and worried about supernatural chastisement, but there's like a natural consequence of our secularism that it just can be very terrible.
You know what, gentlemen, one thing I'm thinking watching this, I'm so thankful for the weather, that it is not too hot here for the Holy Father, because remember we anticipated really high temperatures here in Lisbon, coming from that heat wave that struck Rome. That made international news, where I think the temperature reached 43 degrees Celsius. Don't ask me what that is in Fahrenheit for our American viewers.
Well, I think in Fahrenheit it's very hot.
Very hot. There's the translation. I'm not a meteorologist, but I'll tell you very hot. But we were anticipating that it could be just as hot perhaps here in Lisbon. Yeah. And for Pope Francis, even short distances, being out in that baking heat of the sun, that would have been very uncomfortable. But thankfully today the weather has been absolutely pleasant. And there's a nice breeze coming in. And they say it may get hotter later in the week, which could be a challenge for Pope Francis, especially on Saturday when he's up in Fatima, out in the sunlight. But so far it's been pleasant.
Yes, and we can note on the schedule many of the events are being held in the evenings. I think of the Stations of the Cross, but I think also especially of the Vigil, and then the closing Mass is early in the morning. So very prudently organized, I think. But also a point that you made earlier, that we recognize Pope Francis's physical limitations. that some of the events have been cut short. This isn't necessarily as packed a schedule as he might have had just a few years ago. Again, being very prudent for the Holy Father, but also giving him that opportunity to sort of husband his strength.
Yes.
So he can bring the most and the most help to those who are here.
Yeah, it's time to recharge the batteries and get ready to go out. And actually, the Mass on Sunday, of course, we'll be covering live. That, for viewers, just to make sure you mark in your mind to watch that live in EWTN, because that is going to be, it always is spectacular, isn't it, at the end of World Youth Day?
Yeah.
And that's happening in Tejo Park, the other side of the city. That's where we are at the moment.
And usually, I recently watched John Paul's closing mass at Denver in '93, and it is, they put a lot of emphasis. His themes are really represented there, so it's going to be a very powerful message, and to see the young people. And I'm sure they're going to have some adoration on the vigil, and that's great, to lead the young people in adoration. Leading people to the source. We were talking about in Australia when Pope Benedict did that, and they brought out a kneeler. He knelt and quiet at the stadium. The stadium just felt quiet. It's like, when do you see young people quiet like that? I mean, it was powerful. Because I think we talk about the presence of the Pope, and even though the world in some sense rebels against authority, we want a leader, right? We want to be shepherd. We recognize a need for that to organize us, to lead us, and we can hear the voice of Christ in our shepherds. Jesus in the gospel, he looks with compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. We need that. In the sacrament of holy orders, and the bishop is the fullness of holy orders, there's the presence of Christ. There's the presence of the shepherd to his flock. And there's a special, chemistry's not, but there's a special thing that happens there when the two come together.
There is an innate longing in us to find the truth.
Right.
And we saw that in spades with Pope St. John Paul II in proclaiming the truth. Pope Francis will be bringing that message of truth. And we live in an era, a culture that is also looking for truth, but what it considers to be true is very different from the truth. And I think that's one of the areas where the message of the popes can be so powerful for a culture and can be really transformative.
Well, it's going to be fascinating to hear what that message is when indeed Pope Francis speaks to the President, Prime Minister and the civil authorities here in Lisbon. You're watching World Youth Day 2023 on EWTN, day 2 of our live coverage. We're going to take a quick break, but we're going to be back in just a few moments as we follow Pope Francis's motorcade and more analysis and coverage from the team here as we come to you live from Eduardo Park, right beside the airport in the heart of Lisbon. See you in a moment. And a warm welcome back to Eduardo Park in the heart of beautiful Lisbon, the Portuguese capital, as we bring you EWTN's continuous live coverage of World Youth Day 2023. Officially, it all started yesterday, but today we are just after welcoming Pope Francis as he touched down at Lisbon's International Airport, right next to us here. And if you're just joining us, you're very welcome, no matter where you may be watching in the world. I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Bunsen and Father Mark Mary Christina. Matthew, we were talking about the Pope. We saw him arrive there, about the meetings he is going to have, and now we anticipate in any moment his motorcade will make its way to the presidential palace. And I had a glimpse there of the small white car he has. Another hallmark of Pope Francis, he always opts for the humble, minimal mode of transport as well.
I remember in 2015 when Pope Francis came to the United States and...
They had a massive limousine or something for him and he said no.
Well, it was a tiny car. As members of the press, we were able to look at it, and it is as small as it seems.
Yeah, they're small cars.
He opts for the Fiat, the small version of the Fiat. But that's Pope Francis. He's sending a message that he is a humble shepherd, and that phrase of his that he wants to have the smell of the sheep. Well, one of the ways you have the smell of the sheep is by eschewing a massive motorcade. Certainly his choice. Future popes may decide to go for different reasons.
Could be security reasons.
Could be security. Yep. We have seen Pope Francis use also the famous Pope Mobile.
Yes.
As he processes in some locations. I expect that we'll see something similar here, but we'll have to see, again, his mobility. I think a lot of those decisions will be made sort of at the moment as to how he's feeling and how mobile he is.
And it's always interesting to see what happens to the car itself that he uses in a country. I know in Ireland when he visited 2016 or 18, when he went to Ireland his last...
I believe it was 18, yeah.
18. The small white car, the Fiat that he used, was then donated to a charity in Northern Ireland to use for their charity work as well.
Right.
So it's a pretty neat thing that they have the car that was used for the papal visit. But Father Mark, this is just one of many things that changed under Pope Francis, isn't it? When he became Pope in 2013, it was also, you know, moving from the papal palace into the smaller, more humble apartment in St. Martha's.
Yeah.
So just a slightly different tone with Pope Francis with these visits.
I remember in Brazil, he used I think it was a Ford car, Fiesta or something, and like we'd cram into these Ubers here or something like that. But it is part of the spirituality of the lady is to live a simple life, right? And I think he's communicating that. It's kind of funny. Lamborghini, I think, gives him that papal colored Lamborghini. They give it to some charity, I think, but.
He signed the Lamborghini, blessed it, and then they auctioned it off for charity.
So the world's always tempting us, right?
Yes. I mean, that's a good test. If Father would take the Lamborghini, or would you give it away? It's a tough one.
I mean, obviously, I think we all realize the materialism, the consumerism today is just like off the charts. You know, we got Amazon, all these big companies, corporations, always vying for us to choke out that seed, not be the good soil to receive it, but these cares of the world. So, you know, I've heard him described as a dynamic evangelist. You know, I think kind of his method is like, I was reading this in an article that he is one of accompaniment. He's like a fellow journeyman on the way, you know, and I think that's beautiful. His sense of humor in things, and that he's willing to try different things to get the word out there. You know, it's a gift of him.
It's funny when you say the Lamborghini. I mean, it's not a sin to be wealthy and be successful,
Correct.
right? And I remember just 2 weeks ago, I think we aired it last week, I went to New York to Manhattan to interview Al Kelly, who was the CEO of Visa Corporation for many years, one of the biggest financial institutions in the world. Now he's the executive chairman, earning tens of millions a year. But he sees his responsibility. He's also a board member of the Mother Cabrini Foundation, the health foundation that gives $150 million to various charities all over the state of New York every year. So being wealthy and successful, having the Lamborghini in it of itself is fine as long as you have that responsibility to give back.
Right.
Your Christian duty.
Right. I always believe that Lazarus in the gospel was something of a man of means, right? And Jesus was friends with them, and we're all called to be detached. You know, it's how do we use the money? I mean, EWTN depends on donations, you know, and wealthy people and normal everyday people. Most donations come from that side of it, but certainly wealthy people contribute greatly to EWTN. So it's needed. It's what we do with it in our detachment.
And isn't it amazing, because of the help of EWTN donors and viewers as well, as you said, ordinary people at home who give what they can, as Mother Angelica used to say, between the electricity and the gas bill.
Right.
If you can remember us, please do. But being here in Lisbon with, as the viewers can see, this setup here with the cameras, we have studios just like this broadcasting in Spanish, German, Polish as well. We have journalists on the papal flight who are covering it too. We have a massive studio set up over at Tejo Park. It's an expensive game, television, to do it properly, to get the coverage done well. So you need the resources to do it and to get the message out there.
I think that is a beautiful aspect here. Right, this isn't cheap. I mean, the stages and altars are elaborate. They put time, money, artistic talent into making it as beautiful as possible. They're not skimping on that. I think that's a great message of Catholicism, that, you know, we use everything we have to worship the Lord in the most beautiful way. And like our beautiful churches and things, especially in Europe, it's something beautiful the poor can enjoy.
Yes.
They can see great art, architecture, and that lifts us up to God. That's a first step.
But also the work that EWTN does, for example, bringing this papal trip, the travels of Pope Francis, what he says, his teachings, unedited to the world. His message to the young people is going to be broadcast literally all over the world, and of course on all of our digital platforms, through our affiliates and our very impressive social media presence. So that opportunity then for someone I know, because we all get emails and messages from people all over the world, from as far away as Macau and Nigeria and South Africa and even Mongolia. We will hear from people. that they were able to follow Pope Francis. Every week, for example, we do his Angelus and his general audiences. So that message of helping Pope Francis to communicate that message, but how do we do it? We do it by all the means of communications.
Yes.
But as you say, it's not an inexpensive venture.
And we know how blessed we are and lucky and grateful for the support, because even with Pope Francis's visit to South Sudan, as we mentioned, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, I went with a cameraman to South Sudan a couple of weeks beforehand to get a sense of what it's like for people on the ground, life on the ground for ordinary people in South Sudan. And, you know, getting to South Sudan, not an easy or cheap task. Getting around in South Sudan safely as well for the crew to be able to capture that footage, capture it in a beautiful professional way, bring it back, edit it, package it, and share it with the world. But it's a great thing we're able to do. What a pleasure and a blessing it is.
Then also to be able to carry and to cover Pope Francis's journeys to those locations. In South Sudan, a war-torn country, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and elsewhere in these far-flung regions where life can be very difficult, where you have civil strife and war. And Pope Francis is a true apostle of peace.
And the interesting thing as well, of course, covering the papal journey as we are doing now, I know a lot of Catholic outlets do that as well. But for example, when we went to South Sudan beforehand, when we were there with the EWTN microphone and T-shirts, looking around in the middle of the jungle region of Rumbek, we're the only journalists there beforehand. And they're looking at us saying, wow, you came here? You for real? Before this, you know, the entourage and the security that you're afforded with the Pope. So it is great that we're able to go to those places.
Right, but that's one of the things that is so important about these papal journeys. We talk about there's a diplomatic aspect to it, but there's also, for someone like Pope Francis, we've seen this also with other popes, Benedict XVI and John Paul II, that you are going to those corners of the world where a lot of people don't want to look.
Yeah.
You saw a leper colony, I know, a place where no one wants to go. But there are stories there that have to be told. And Pope Francis is shining a light on those parts of the world where you have the forgotten. It's why he always refers to the peripheries, the peripheria, as he calls it. But we also, as journalists, then have an obligation to go there as well.
And talk about a biblical connection and that leprosy colony. And yes, there are still leprosy colonies in many parts of the world where the people are shunned, forbidden for living in the towns and villages because they're seen as unsafe, unclean. So we went to this place where there are 5,000 people, women, men, children with leprosy. Today you can see their hands were missing, fingers, feet, toes. And the only place where they're welcomed is at the local Catholic church.
That's right.
Who will bring them in. And we'll go collect them and help them because they can't walk there, many of them. The only place they're helping them were Catholic missionaries. I mean, you see that. It is the incredible work of the Catholic Church. And that's just one example. We could talk about it all day here. You have that all over the world.
I was in Ethiopia back in February, and I'm forgetting the name of the town we were in, but it was a kind of a bigger city for them, and they had the Missionaries of Charity. It was in this area of town where they had like a lot of drug addiction. They have this chat addiction, they call it, and you could see all these guys that were kind of strung out on it. But the Missionaries of Charity, they had a compound, and it was like a bit of heaven. They actually had like grass and lawns and trees, and they had like 120 people. You know, they had like a ward for unwed mothers and things, and then the mentally disabled. And it literally was, the only way I described it to people was it was like a piece of heaven, you know, in all this suffering and difficulty.
And one person I spoke to in South Sudan about that, the church booming there, young people, and he said, Cullum, there are so many problems in South Sudan, the youngest country in the world, and when the government often doesn't have the means or doesn't have the want to help those who are really, really suffering, when people look and they see a nun in a habit or priest with a collar, they see there's help. There's someone who will not pass me by. They also see education, healthcare, empowerment. That's what they told me, and that's why it's booming in places like that.
And the Pope becomes a global representative of exactly what you've just said.
And when you look at now, as we see on the screen here, the Pope's vehicle about to leave the airport and travel through Lisbon, of course, this is a first world country, a wealthy, developed country, but not without its problems as well. We saw some homeless on the street. Thankfully, Lisbon and Portugal, I'm told, doesn't have a huge problem with homelessness like you might have in some cities in the United States at the moment. But still, there are people here with depression problems, I've been told as well, anxiety, and the Pope will speak to them as well, to those people.
Well, and one of the messages of this Pope, of other popes, really of all popes is that, yes, you may be well-developed, you may be financially well-off, you may not have the same social problems, but you can still suffer from deep, abiding spiritual poverty. And that's one of the warnings, I think, that Pope Francis gave. That's one of the warnings that Pope Benedict gave when he was here during his apostolic visit about that spiritual poverty.
Remember that great moment when Mother Teresa visited New York City, and she was down in Manhattan and in different places, and then she went up to the Bronx. Now, today, even the Bronx is known as a disadvantaged area, but back then, it was a very dangerous, gang-driven area, and all the reporters were crowded around Mother Teresa and said, Mother Teresa, what do you think, what you've seen here today? What's your reaction? And she said, it is awful. I've never seen such poverty and hardship. People here have nothing. The people down in Manhattan. She was talking about the wealthy people down in Manhattan.
Right.
That spiritual poverty.
Right.
And all the journalists were just flabbergasted. She was talking about the people. It was just a very powerful moment when she made the message you just said, Matthew.
Well, it is possible to suffer from spiritual starvation. And we were talking earlier about the innate longing for the truth, that connection, that relationship.
And you've seen this too, Father Mark, when you've gone to places like Africa and certain parts of Asia where people seem to have they seem to have such a strong spirit despite the hardship that they have. There is this strong spirit, the spirit of the African people. We hear that a lot.
Right. We were working. I was there with a group working with some priests for about almost 3 weeks, and one day we went to one of their parishes. They didn't, the people in the area didn't have running water, electricity, beautiful countryside, but yeah, I was struck by the joy. In fact, I mean, I couldn't speak their language, but afterwards we were meeting with the parishioners, and I remember I just got my iPhone out and just started video, and just asking them their name, just for them to tell me their name, and they had the biggest smile. And I was literally I mean, it's kind of cliche, but I was thinking, they have the gift of joy.
Yes.
And an American would look at that and say, you have so little. How do you have this joy? Where is it coming from? But it was just radiating.
I remember going to Mass in Tanzania. And first it was about 2 hours, which...
Yeah. I went to one in Angola once that was 5.5 hours. And let me tell you, that was a test of my faith. That was
So don't complain about long preaching, right?
But the joy, the music of this Mass, and the reverence, we were talking earlier about the reverence, how quiet everything became. In the midst of this joy, this ebullient joy, sudden reverence, the quiet throughout the Eucharistic prayer was just remarkable. One of the things I will always remember. But to that, in regions where there is that material poverty, we can still see that immense wealth of prayer life and an understanding. It's one of the reasons why I think Africa has become so important to the world and to the church, growing as it is, but to be this voice of clarity in teaching.
And with geopolitical instability now, resource mineral shortages as well, you can see how Africa as well, is such exploitation happening in various African countries as well, as there's a race for more lithium and different materials. And it's always the people who are the lowest, they always suffer the most. And that continues to happen today, which is something Pope Francis keeps calling for again and again, that equality and companies' social responsibility if they are taking resources out of African countries to help the people.
Yeah, Francis uses a very important phrase. It's called ideological colonization, where he talks about the colonialism still exists, but it's an ideological colonialism where too many governments in the West, even NGOs and the United Nations and others, will attach to development and promises of aid that you have to also embrace an agenda that will destroy the family, that brings in abortion and contraceptives, and the whole of the LGBTQ plus, what Pope Francis calls gender ideology.
And it's amazing when we've traveled all over the world for EWTN News, producing reports, and you see various groups from the United Nations. When we were in South Sudan, actually, and I mention it so much because it's in recent memory, but I think the World Food Programme was bringing back their operations there because of lack of funding. So they were simply shortening their food supplies that they were having at a time when more and more people desperately needed food. But you go anywhere in the world, various groups come and go and they do amazing work, but it's always the Catholic Church that you see there in it for the long run.
Yeah.
And these people are not doing presentations back at headquarters in New York and getting the clap on the back. They're not becoming famous on social media. They're doing it quietly. I know so many times for EWTN, we have heard of a group of sisters, let's say, doing work somewhere. We've contacted them. We would love to come and film the work for EWTN, show the world the incredible work you're doing in whatever part of the world. And they say, we just want to do our work quietly, help the people. We're not doing it for glory. We're doing it for the glory of God. It's incredible, all over the world.
Yeah, I saw that in Ethiopia where in the diocese, the bishop was very much involved in the distributing all the donations that come in, into Africa. And I remember we were driving by this one place where they were, like a couple times a month, they were giving out bags of grain. And it was from the U.S., and the church was there involved to help distribute it. And so the people were all lined up, and they're going away with these big sacks of grain. And one of the priests I was with, he was from the West, and he said, I wouldn't even know what to do with a bag of grain. It's like they were so happy. It's like, we're so have such a different life, and that's a great role of the popes. That just to call us to, attention, to be reminded of the developing world. How can developed nations help them, and what can we do?
Well, we want to be fair to these charitable organizations. The Catholic Church has been at this for 2,000 years.
And as I say, they do incredible work as well, and we partner with many of them as well, the Catholic Church does. And I remember last year when we went to Ukraine a few times, while embassies were shutting up and getting out in various groups, we were going in with the Pontifical Mission Society, going in with supplies who had come from the United States, and the Order of Malta. They're just doing incredible work all over the country.
And you mentioned like sisters especially, that's been such a loss, the declining numbers in religious life to run these schools, to run these kind of, another place in Ethiopia, they had a leper colony there, and they did hospital work and an orphanage and everything, and it was so beautiful. We visited those places, and that is such a real loss. I mean, I think the religious sister especially models just that humble service. The priest is in charge of a parish and got this power and authority, and the beauty of the women religious are there. Their presence alone is powerful, and of course the service of the work. And that's what I felt like being in Africa. I look at the young people, and the ones that didn't have like that educational opportunities just to develop themselves. To me, that was one of the saddest things that I felt like I saw, that the loss.
Well, in South Sudan as well, we filmed a report at the first secondary school, we call it in Europe, high school in America, that was just for girls. Normally girls past the age of 10 would never be educated in South Sudan. Catholic Church comes in, a group of Loreto sisters from Dublin, from my neck of the woods, and they opened up the first secondary school in the country just for girls, telling parents, rather than selling them for cows, which is what happens still today in South Sudan, that you let them get an education, get a profession and a job, and it will pay off long term for the family. Because many of these families are so poor, and they just, the daughter is swapped off for cows for marriage, and that's how they survive.
Yeah.
Now, if you just joined us, conscious that people are tuning in all the time, this is Pope Francis, his motorcade, as he makes his way from the airport into the city of Lisbon. You're watching EWTN's live coverage of World Youth Day. This is Colm Flynn here. I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Bunson, Father Mark Mary Christina. We're sitting in a studio in Eduardo Park, right next to the airport, where we had the opening mass yesterday. Beautiful celebration with hundreds of thousands of young people. The place was just packed with people from all over the world. So today we have Pope Francis arriving this morning. He will be here in Lisbon until Sunday, where he will conclude with his final mass, the closing mass of World Youth Day. And I believe, is that the Pope waving out the window, maybe one of his security personnel in the back? We're just squinting to see the monitor here, watching with you, and people coming out to wish him well.
The Holy Father's movement throughout a city is different in some ways. As we've noted, Pope Francis chooses to have a slightly more humble form of transportation. But Pope Francis also historically has been willing to go in parts of cities that are perhaps not as safe as others. I can think of a number of visits that he's done in places like Africa and elsewhere. I think of the Central African Republic, for example, that I think it was Bangui, that was something of a real security risk given many of the political problems that they've had. But again, Pope Francis chooses to go to those places. Portugal, an incredibly safe country. We have been blessed to spend these last days here. But Pope Francis, as we can see, as a head of state, is also receiving all due courtesy and security as he proceeds now to have his brief encounter with the President of Portugal.
It always is, I think, funny to see when the little small white car surrounded by all the black security detail. Is just a funny contrast, but a beautiful thing to see. With the lovely formation of the motorcycles as well from the Portuguese police in the front. Well, you're watching, as I say, EWTN's live coverage. We are going to take a short break, but we're going to be back in a moment here live from Eduardo Park with our continuous coverage of Pope Francis's visit here to Lisbon across the week and his first day going to meet the President and Prime Minister of the nation. We'll have more right after this.